Hi guys! As a general rule, I don't do reading challenges. I don't like putting pressure on myself to hit a specific metric or to read a certain number of books, especially when I turn to books to slow down, reflect, and be more present. Instead, I like to think in terms of direction, like what I want to move towards. Each year, rather than making resolutions, I make a vision board, and with that philosophy in mind, I've come up with 5 reading intentions for the upcoming year. They're not rules and they're not quotas, but they are questions that I want my reading to help me answer. So today I'm sharing those 5 intentions with you. The first intention is about turning towards something that I've been neglecting, which is nonfiction. So I'd like to read more nonfiction. And the question that I want this to help me answer by the end of the year is, what can nonfiction offer me that fiction can't? I've always been more drawn to fiction than to nonfiction for a number of reasons. Number one, I love being transported through storytelling. And while nonfiction sometimes can have wonderful storytelling, it's not as common as it is in fictional works, at least in my experience. And I also love beautiful prose, and it's harder to find that in a lot of nonfiction works. Again, of course, there are exceptions. And because I haven't read much nonfiction, maybe I am kind of undervaluing how well that can be done in nonfiction. In any case, I do feel like I've set these restrictions on myself because I tend to always go for a work of fiction, and I think I am missing out a little bit. One of the books that I read last month, which I talked about in my reading wrap-up, is this one here, Every Living Thing, which is a work of nonfiction, and it actually was my favorite read of the month. It reminded me that reality can often be stranger than fiction, and that true stories can be told in a very engrossing way without fictionalizing them and without over-exaggerating. And I think that kind of spurred me on to the possibility of reading a lot more nonfiction in the coming year. Plus, there's so many important historical events and real-life stories that have not been fictionalized, so I don't have the opportunity to learn about them tangentially by reading fiction, which is usually my preference. And I don't want to continue to limit myself in that regard. Now, the challenge here for me is going to be seeking nonfiction that also satisfies my need for storytelling. I think that memoirs are the easiest way into that. When I do read nonfiction, I tend to enjoy a well-written memoir in particular. But I also want to expand into reading more historical texts, more primary sources as well. I'm really interested in reading Leonardo da Vinci's journals, because I once did read an autobiography about him that I found pretty fascinating, and I would like to just directly read what he wrote in his journals. Currently, I am reading Apollo's Angels, which is about ballet, because that's just a particular love of mine, and I'm hoping to finish it this month in December, but I'm only this far along, and it is quite long. So if I don't finish it, then this will be one of my first nonfiction reads for 2026. I've also got The Origin of Species lined up here. I've had this really lovely little edition for a long time, obviously Charles Darwin, and I have not read it, even though it's been sitting on my bookshelf, but I was inspired to read it because it does come up in this book that I really enjoyed last month. So that was the impetus that I needed to decide I'm finally going to actually read this really important scientific text. Another one that I'm hoping to read is this one called Black Miami in the 20th Century. Miami's where I'm from, and I actually have this as a signed copy, and it's just been sitting on my bookshelf, but it is important history that I'm really curious to know more about, and so this is another one that's on my list for this year. I'm going to try to read one nonfiction title each month, but I'm not by any means setting that as a hard goal. If I read 6 or 7 works of nonfiction throughout the year, I'll be satisfied with that, because last year I only read 4 total. Another genre that I'd like to read more of is poetry. I need to work on letting the short form linger, and I want to learn what type of focus reading lots of poetry requires from me compared to reading long form prose. I tend to read a little poem here and there, but I don't often read entire collections of poetry. So that's an intention this year for me as well. What's weird is that when I do deeply engage with a poem, it's uniquely rewarding, and it certainly satisfies my love for figurative language and musicality, and it's actually my favorite kind of literature to teach. I really love getting students, oops, I thought that was a bug on the floor. It was just my mic. I really love getting students into poetry, but I don't read nearly enough of it myself. I think that I just like to spend time with a story that's going to take me on a journey, and poems are over entirely too quickly and oftentimes don't necessarily have a plot. It's not until after multiple reads that a poem starts to really kind of seep in for me. And I rarely reread, as I have discussed before in a previous video. So this year, I want to get more comfortable with the more abstract, less linear experience of reading poetry collections. Rereading poems to strike a chord, making connections between related poems, and then revisiting certain poems in light of those connections. When I visited the Miami Book Fair earlier this year, I purchased a few poetry collections by local authors, so I intend to try to read those this year. And I also want to read some of the romantic classics, which I have sitting on my bookshelf, Shelley, Byron, Keats, etc. And I also would like to read some Baudelaire in French. Here's just one example. So I've got Baudelaire, Petit Poème en prose. Sorry, I started saying that in English and then realized I should be speaking in French. Petit poème en prose, Le spleen de Paris. And so this actually moves me into the third intention that I have, which is to read more books in foreign languages, the foreign languages that I speak. That would be Spanish and French. I think of this goal as claiming the original voice, and what I want to know is what changes when I meet a book in the language it was originally written in. Now, technically, my first language is Spanish because even though I was born in the States, my parents chose to speak Spanish to me exclusively until I started school. So it is my first language. However, I'm not as comfortable with it when it comes to reading and writing because it was never my academic language. Most of my life, I have done the grand majority of my reading and writing in English. Now, the French language has been a lifelong love of mine. It started when I was little with ballet steps, which are all in French, and that kind of got me curious to learn more of the language. And then in middle school and in high school, I took French throughout, and then it was my second major in college, and I've lived abroad in France twice. So it's been with me a long time, and I actually have done more academic reading and writing in French than I have in Spanish. So even though Spanish is much more natural for me as like a spoken language, with French, I've had much more experience on the academic end. Basically, I have literacy gaps in both languages, just in different ways, and I refuse to read literature that was originally written in Spanish or in French in English, because my thinking is, why would I read it in English when I can read it in its original language? However, it's more daunting a task to read it in the original Spanish or French than it is to read it in English. So I end up just like putting off great works of literature that I really do feel like I should have read by this point. So one of them that is on my bookshelf and that I pulled out for this video is Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude, which is a book that I'm almost positive I will love, but because it's in Spanish, every time that I pick it up and think about reading it, I end up kind of putting it down and just grabbing something else. So this is the year. This is the year that I'm going to be reading this. And then, Les Mis has been sitting on my bookshelf for years and years, and that's a particularly daunting one because it's so lengthy and because it's a much older text as well, but it is one that I also would like to read. So I have a little bit of a list in my mind of the Spanish and French language books that I'd like to read, but I am not setting any goals on how many or which specific works I'd like to read. I just know that I would like to read a few works in Spanish and a few works in French in 2026. Going from the new to the old, my next intention is to reread my favorite works. I'm calling this the value of return, and what I'd like to know is whether or not it might teach me something about myself to reread my all-time favorites. I talk at length about why I rarely reread books in a recent video, which I'll post up here and down in the description box. But one of the reasons is my fear of ruining that magic of the first read. I don't think that I'm ever going to be somebody who rereads a lot But this year, I would like to try rereading my absolute favorites and to just trust that I will still love them, even if they don't hit in exactly the same way that they did the first time. Naturally, I'm going to be reading these books with a much more critical eye, and I'll be analyzing not just the books, but myself in a way, because I'll be thinking about why I love these books so much in the first place. So it's kind of a meta reading practice, I think, and that should be interesting. I did actually do this with one book already towards the end of this year, which was Frankenstein. I posted an entire video about that. It was a good experience. I will link that as well up here and down below in the description. But there are a number of favorites that I would like to get back to this year. So those include books like Wuthering Heights, Crime and Punishment, The Picture of Dorian Gray, Jane Eyre, I'm trying to remember what else, Persuasion. There's a couple others, but I would say like a handful, 5 to 7 books that I would like to try to revisit. Again, if I don't get to all of them, that's okay, but I'm definitely planning to get to a few. My final intention is also a way of looking back and going back to the source by reading/studying Greek mythology. And the question that I want to consider on that journey is, why do these ancient stories continue to shape the way that we see ourselves? I fell in love with Greek mythology freshman year of high school. So we had Greek Day, and in our English classes, they assigned each student a different character from Greek myth, and we had to come dressed up as a character and do a little presentation. I was Pandora, so you're welcome for the evils of the world. That was me. There's definitely been a resurgence in recent years of Greek myth via Greek myth retellings, and I've read a few of those, but now I'm just longing to get back to the originals. I'm drawn to mythologies in general, and I'd like this to be a first step for me to explore other world mythologies, but I think it makes sense to start with Greek myth because it serves as such an underpinning of Western literature, and there's also this familiarity with it that I think will allow me to dig deeper more quickly. I think I'm going to get started with Edith Hamilton's classic Mythology, which is also a work of nonfiction, so 2 birds, 1 stone with this one, and I think it'll serve as a nice refresher of Greek myth in general and a good jumping off point to then seek out other sources about the stories. And then I'd like to go back to some of the classic works, obviously the Odyssey. I'm not sure I'm going to reread the Iliad because there's so many lengthy battle scenes there and I tend to kind of glaze over when I read those. But I do remember enjoying the Odyssey a lot, so I probably will reread that one. So again, 3 birds, 1 stone there because it would be, no, 2 birds. So reread, and it's Greek myth. This is a nonfiction and Greek myth. So anyway, there's some overlap with my intentions is what I'm saying. So I'm going to probably reread the Odyssey, and there's a film version coming out for that pretty soon. So I'm going to probably tie those together. And then I'd like to read some of the classic plays. I have them sitting on my bookshelf, Sophocles, Aristophanes, etc. I think I'd like to end my journey with the book Gods Behaving Badly, which is contemporary, but I think that it would be a fun way to kind of round out the whole thing. So I kind of have a whole little makeshift curriculum in my mind for this. Overall, I want to come to some more thoughtfully developed conclusions on why we keep coming back to these stories again and again. And I think that it's also going to enrich my reading of so many other classic works, you know, from Shakespeare to more recent works like The Secret History or the Percy Jackson books. So those are my reading intentions for the year ahead. I don't expect to fulfill all 5 perfectly, and I certainly will not be reading exclusively within those categories. But I will have these questions in the back of my mind when I'm making my reading selections throughout the year. For me, that's what makes reading goals meaningful. It's not whether you fulfill them perfectly, but whether they get you to read with more intention and curiosity. I'd love to know if you make any reading goals or more strict resolutions or just general intentions for the upcoming year. And if so, provide some examples down in the comments below. I'd love to hear more. However your reading life looks right now, I hope that your next book is a good one. And with that, I'm signing off for 2025. So happy reading and Happy New Year. Bye-bye.